before I get into like any of this, I just want to flash, well, one, I want to correct something. I think the program says 2021. I forgot that we got COVIDed out that year. 3 years ago, I was up here for my very first conference presentation ever at BSides 2022 that I submitted in 2021. So before I get into anything, I just wanted to say how thankful I am for BSidesCharm, for the group here, the community. I love the student focus. I love coming up to Baltimore. This is where this all started, and so getting to come back almost 3 years to the day, now with somebody else on stage with me, to talk about what happened in 2024, what happened in 2021, it means a great, great deal to me. So I'm really, really excited to be here at BSidesCharm to talk about this. So, I'm Andrew, this is Veronica. We're here to talk about what happened with election security in 2024. A little bit of background. I used to do some fun stuff with the government. I was a part of what was called the Election Security Group at US Cyber Command. We worked a little bit with the NSA as well. I got to do fun things. The mustache was redacted at the time behind the mask, as was the name tag, but I promise that was me. I've since left the Army, which is why you don't see that government disclaimer at the bottom anymore, which means now I can say whatever I want about this. Now we've got this little project that you're going to hear a little bit about, that we've gotten to contribute to over the last couple years, and gotten to go out and work with campaigns, with state and local parties, and found a way to keep doing this incredibly complicated, frustrating, but awesome thing called election security. And I've gotten to do it after the government, and it's been a lot of fun. So, when I started this came out of some grad school research back in 2020, 2021. Here's what the world looked like back then. We were coming out of the 2020 midterms. It was still kind of recent history with 2016 and that whole debacle. Things were crazy back then. Election security was pretty fresh in people's minds. We had this conception of what could happen to high-level campaigns for president, for Senate, if they got hacked, but it was still kind of pretty early on in election security's history. Since then, the problem looks a little bit different. This threat has mutated in a way that has just been astonishing to watch. The rise of AI has enabled both cybercriminals, nation-state-sponsored threat actors, and election security-specific threats in a way that I don't think a lot of us saw coming. It has totally changed the threat landscape for campaigns. We're going to talk a little bit about like how a campaign works and like to help you understand sort of what this political thing looks like, because I'm pretty sure there's like 2 people in the audience here who've worked at all with campaigns before. Yes, I'm looking at you, Tim. It's a really weird space. But the thing is that you've got the background noise of cybercrime and your typical threat activity that just like targets any type of small business, of which a campaign basically is one. Then you've got nation states looking to spend, in 2024's case, almost $500 million on this. For context, the Biden campaign spent about $1.6 billion on the 2024 elections. I don't know of any other asymmetry quite so big as in election security, when you have local and state campaigns that spend maybe a few $1,000s if they're lucky enough to get it, but you have motivated state-sponsored threat actors spending orders of magnitude greater. The difference between attackers and defenders in this field it's wild. But we're going to get into all that.
Perfect. So as Andrew said, my name's Veronica. I'm effectively a layperson. I'm actually in the legal space. I'm in law school right now, so sorry to disappoint you guys. There is somebody who will be a lawyer up here. And also in this style of law school, I'm going to cold call in this room. I'm just kidding. We're going to take volunteers. We want to give you some basics as to understanding what political campaigns look like, the scale of them across the U.S., and also the tech stack that goes behind them.
ChatGPT did me so dirty on that image.
He said,
I did not give it a picture of myself. I just asked it to generate something.
Yeah, even the laptop is scary. Okay, so Does anybody want to answer this first question? How many elected positions do we think there are in the United States? You can shout it out. Thousands? Okay.
Thousands.
Million. Hundreds of thousands? That's closer. That's closer. There are 500,000 elected positions in the United States. And what percent of these do we think are local positions? 70? Okay. Well, I hate to inform you, 99.9% of them are local positions. And what percentage do we think that they're uncontested? 90s? Yeah, well, it's 70%, so well above 50. And our final question to take us out is, what percent of them are filled by people who are angry about something? 100, yeah. So we wanted to give you guys this context to understand the scope and scale of what we're dealing with, especially because we want to focus on that fact that 99% of these elected positions are local, which means that there are people like me who don't have tech backgrounds who are building up these campaigns very quickly and taking them down just as quick.
When we think about campaigns and we think about elections, I think we really quickly tend to envision the Biden-Harris campaign, the Trump campaign, with billions of dollars of receipts, with hundreds of staff, headquarters across the country. It's a really, well, thousands, yes. It's a really, really sophisticated operation. That is the top 0.0001% of those, that amount of campaigns. The pyramid is vanishingly small at the tippy top. 499,000 of those campaigns have nowhere near that level of resourcing. And again, because they're so local, this is like people in the room going out and running for office. This happens in our communities for school boards, for sheriff's offices, for judges. It's something that kind of gets at the heart of this election security problem because it's intensely local and personal. But specific to the problems we're talking about today, try to think more about those local and state level races that aren't as resourced and aren't as capable or aren't as staffed as those big campaigns are, because that's just such a small amount of them. So when we look at political campaigns and the tech that they're using, we know that a whole ecosystem of apps and websites are going into these campaigns. And because of that, there is a high likelihood of people using personal accounts or email addresses, creating Gmail addresses, and then signing up their campaign for various apps like Slack, using Facebook, using Instagram, and these donor web pages where a lot of personal information, not only about the politicians or the local government individuals who are running, but also about the people who support them, is available on these web pages. And you have strapped for resources digital directors, like I guess that's supposed to be me, who don't necessarily know how to manage all of this data. They don't know the most sanitary way of keeping their accounts clean. They don't have the resources that everybody in this room has. I know I didn't before I started working with Andrew. So remember, like we're talking about local small campaigns where you've got a candidate and then maybe a part-time campaign manager, if you're lucky, who's probably related to you in some way. A campaign is basically a startup. It's a startup that's going to exist between 3 to 12 months. And no matter what happens at the end of that 12 months, even if they win, they're shutting down. They're spun up very, very quickly. You're asked to set up a website, email accounts, a tech stack that in some ways is familiar to you, but in a lot of ways, we're talking about some of the tech that's definitely not. It comes up really, really quick, and if it loses, campaigns die in about 2 to 3 days. Staff goes on to find other jobs, volunteers go back to their day jobs, and the campaign goes away. It's a really, really fast-paced world, and it's brutal. This is not an industry that's fun to work in. It takes a lot of passion and it takes a lot of interest to want to be in this space, to go work at a campaign that is stressful, underpaid, overworked, and hard. The modern campaign tech stack is really complicated. You have a lot of overlap with startups. You have productivity and collaboration tools, communication platforms like Slack. Then you have this ecosystem called civic tech. Things like NGP Van, WinRed, ActBlue, or Nation Builder. Tech platforms that have been built specifically for campaigns that handle things like text messaging, that handle access to voter rolls. Campaigns out there, even local campaigns like the ones we're talking about in this room, have access, in a lot of cases, that same type of voter information that the presidential campaigns or Senate campaigns have. It's this weird slice of tech that only serves the political campaign industry. But because we're talking startups that exist for just a couple of months, and we're talking organizations without a lot of digital experience, this is where a little bit of that risk starts to creep in that's unique to political campaigns. And it affects not just the folks working there, but it affects anybody who's donating to or contributing to those campaigns. So, when I was looking at this problem, I started local. I started by looking at websites, and I wanted to understand, how do I find every political campaign and party domain in the country? Out of all 500,000 of those candidates, most of them actually don't need a website. A lot of times you can just go out and knock on 50 doors and that's enough to win a local election. Most of these races are decided by a few dozen votes. But if I wanted to understand, okay, like what does the digital ecosystem look like for campaigns in the country? Step number one, find all of the domains out there. Not as trivial as it might sound. Number two, how do I, like en masse, at scale, find what's wrong with them? There's a lot of interesting things I could look at. Other than just running like Nmap against every single political campaign domain in the country, which I didn't think was a good idea, I wanted to look specifically what was that risk at the local level, where a lot of times those ties to the major party offices, the state or national level, wasn't quite as close. And then the most important one, how do I actually get campaigns and party offices to give a shit about it and do something? That's the most important part of this problem. And for all the early career folks and students in the audience, it's really, really fun to build things to solve those first two problems. And I'm going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the tech that went into this, like some of the problems and little CTF-y things you see out there. The hard part and the really impactful part is taking a problem and finding a solution and doing something about it. It's also way more rewarding, and you get to meet a lot of really cool folks along the way and make a couple friends. But that's how you really get to impact. It's not enough just to talk about a problem. You have to offer something and try to solve it. In case you didn't believe me, here's what some state party websites look like. Does anything about this stand out as odd to you? I've redacted a couple of them, even though these are available publicly on the web.
Why wouldn't they use an email that actually is based on the domain?
Right. Why would I put addresses, phone numbers, personal email addresses, in some cases tabulated nicely in a spreadsheet for me to download, directly on their website? What do you mean?
There is no requirement by the Election Commission, federal, state, or local, that says you have to use an email address affiliated with the domain for your campaign.
Yeah, exactly. There's no requirement for it. And oftentimes it's a lot easier just to use what you have existing in your stack. Remember, we're talking about campaigns with 2 to 3 people that, like, one of them's part-time, one of them's related to the other one. Why am I going to pay to set up an email service on top of my domain that's just going to complicate things? I've already got a personal domain. Remember also, like, what we're talking about here. We're not talking about small businesses. Like, I don't know of any corporation or any type of organization that would do this, and it seems kind of silly to all of us in the room. Like, working in security, we can point the finger and say, like, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this? Remember, there is one reason and one reason only why campaigns exist. I hate to burst a bubble, but it's not just to represent your issues, right? It's not to advocate for voters' interests. Campaigns exist to win elections. Every dollar spent by that campaign has to translate into votes, has to translate into a win. The goal of a campaign is to drive towards winning that election. The reason why this happens is because campaigns have made the decision, and I would argue the correct decision, that being accessible and being reachable by their constituents, by their voters, donors, and supporters, outweighs what they understand as the risk of doing something like this. We're talking about organizations that are like fundamentally, by like their purpose is to be publicly reachable. They're there to handle contact from voters, to reach out to donors. Being able to be contacted and get people involved at a local level, that's their most important aspect of existing. So anything that we talk about solution-wise has to respect the function of these organizations. We can't just point the finger and say, hey, like, why are we doing this? Why is this happening?
And stop.
And stop. But here's the Maryland version. I dropped these in earlier. Again, you can go on the web and find these today. So I wanted to figure out, okay, like, so what? If this is happening at the scale that I had a feeling it was happening across the country, like, so what? What's the big deal? If I list all the cell phones, personal email addresses, in some cases addresses, state committee voting records, what's the big deal of doing that? What does the risk actually look like? My first attempt at answering that question was this little thing I called Hookshot. It still lives on my GitHub today. Basically a large-scale web scraper that would go through campaign spending data, go through available national party data to find campaign domains, state party domains, and local party domains, and then correlate what I found on websites against threat intel sources and APIs like Have I Been Pwned, where I can say, okay, well, given the amount of emails I find on a website, what's the actual risk to the organization? This was the early version. Then I told ChatGPT to make it even better. Here's the version that exists now. There's a public version on my GitHub, but then there's also the cloud-based version that I run sort of out on my own that looks at this daily now. A cloud-based elections threat platform that goes out and scrapes every campaign and every party domain in the country about every 90 minutes. I look at domains that are expiring. I look at the domains that are getting re-registered. I look at campaign domains and websites. I see personal emails on there. I can go back to the Internet Archive and pull off old emails. I can look for file attachments that existed from a site that used to be there but now has gotten sandwiched between 2 or 3 other election cycles. The Frankensteinian nature of these tech stacks is wild. Literally, you have WordPress sites from 2004 with pages that still exist as artifacts on some of these pages, and you can go back through and find them. And guess what? Like back then, there was even more emails. Sir? I hope so. Yeah, that's sort of the goal of it, is to be a tool. No, it's good. So I would, where the public version stops is on feeding that information into any type of exploitation. I did not link this into any of the like hack, breach, and leech sources that I have access to. This just merely identifies for, and I'll show you the output of it. Exactly. No. That's a great question. Yeah. Remember, dealing with campaigns and dealing with political cybersecurity, half of the time, someone getting hacked is funny if you're on the other side. But when it happens to your party and your campaign, it's a lot less funny. And so, like, dealing with bipartisan campaigns and working with them, it's a highly fractured ecosystem where just saying the wrong thing, putting out something and saying, hey, here's the list of all the Democratic campaigns and all their private email addresses, immediately alienates half of your potential partners in this space. It's a really, really complex space to be nuanced in, especially when we're trying to speak truth to decision makers. If you ever want to wonder what a CTF problem looks like in the wild, just go look at some old state party websites. I found some interesting cryptography that Cloudflare was putting in place. Sort of the de facto standard for website protection right now is Cloudflare. They even have a program for it called Cloudflare for Campaigns, where they give free access to one of their business tiers to political campaigns. It's an awesome program. The problem is that someone there has figured out that, hey, maybe listing personal email addresses on websites is not the best idea because somebody with different intentions could just go on and scrape all those emails. So we're going to encode them and require JavaScript to render them in the page. That way, if I go look at it through my web browser, totally fine, I can see the email. But a web scraper that goes and tries to pull it down just gets this long encoded string. It's not that hard to undo that, as it turns out. They're not doing any type of actual encryption. This is like the classic example of security through obscurity. We saw some private Google Drive files that get linked in the source code of pages. Remember, when you just start stacking more pages on top of each other, you get these old orphaned links that exist on these websites. We've got a lot of old Airtables being exposed, ELF site IDs. That's a sort of another little web widget for doing table storage off of the location of the website. So we built all this into the engine to detect and find these things and then go out and either download the data from them, pull off whatever was being hosted there, or in some cases just identify when this existed. And here's what it looks like across the country.
So what Andrew in his research and me and some of our other teammates found out is that this is a bipartisan issue, this is a national issue, and there are way more exposed and breached accounts than we had anticipated to find. So it is not a East Coast versus West Coast, North versus South, red versus blue issue. This affects everybody, and it affects everybody equally. And our team is really committed to that mission of understanding the bipartisan nature of this this problem. We didn't want it to become something that, well, it can, because it affects everybody.
Yes, sir.
I'm just trying to look at the colors, and I'm wondering, is there a correlation where a state that happens to be politically red has more attacks on blue and vice versa, or is there no...
These are just two completely random colors that I decided to put on the map for one. But to answer your question, the difference, if anyone's curious, between your average number of emails listed on a Democratic Party website versus a Republican Party website is, I think, like 1 or 2. It is statistically negligible. The average exposure rate, so say I've got 10 email addresses on my website, the average number of those email addresses that I can find in data breaches in the last 3 years between Republicans and Democrats, identical. It is a highly, highly like bipartisan issue. To your question, I think specifically as far as like the differences between some of those states, this just reflects that level of exposed and breach accounts that we found on state and local websites. Doesn't model anything about anybody trying to weaponize that or looking at like attacks on those websites. Would be another interesting data source. Yes, sir.
The exposed accounts, I understand. How are you defining breach account? Like it's showing up in a database?
Accounts that I have a password for found on a breach in the last 3 years.
Okay.
So exposed is can I find either publicly available on the website or in one of those like little hanging ELF site tables or Airtables that I can find. Breach means I found a password for it. Sir. No, that's exposed and exposed. The color scheme, if it happens to match up to anything, might reflect perhaps the difference between two major parties. The goal there to show sort of how just the similarity is. There was another hand up I saw over here somewhere. Someone else have a question on that? Okay, cool. Another thing we wanted to look at, I mentioned this earlier, Cloudflare-based website protection. I wanted to look at two main issues that have like kind of the 3 things that we ask campaigns to look at. It's using a password manager and looking at basic account security. It's setting up website security, and then having some email security solutions. Kind of the 3 most common attack vectors that we see against campaigns. Those things tend to make you harder than the rest of the pack to catch up with. And remember, we're starting at just like a baseline of almost no security and trying to build up something. So 2 of the things that we wanted to look specifically at were whether or not email services have DMARC enabled, and then whether or not the website has Cloudflare website protection or another type of DDoS protection on it. What we found was DMARC rates were still pretty low. The issue here is that a persistent risk for campaigns is that somebody can bogart on their email domain, whether it's an old one or a current one, and send out a message to potential donors and voters and say, hey, donate to this link. But the link goes to a campaign that is not actively engaging in electoral activities. DMARC helps to prevent something like that. Cloudflare, this was kind of an interesting one that pointed towards the difficulty of getting tech, particularly security, to trickle down from the state and national level down to the local level. We're seeing more and more folks jump onto that Cloudflare for Campaigns program, which is an awesome, awesome program that Cloudflare does for free for campaigns through an awesome nonprofit called Defending Digital Campaigns. But that risk was still especially present at the local level. So to me, this pointed to still a lot of work getting done just in making campaigns aware of the problem and the available free solutions they have to deal with it.
So if you remember, we identified those 3 problems. The third was how do we make people care about this? Everybody in this room understands first how silly it might seem to use your personal AOL account to set up a campaign domain. But that's not necessarily true for the general population. People don't necessarily, I'm from Virginia, sorry to the Maryland people, a small local campaign run by a woman in her 60s and a man in his 70s might not understand exactly what's going on. And if you approach them, the talk before us talked about approaching things with empathy and kindness, especially to clients. Approaching people and saying, "Hey, I have the password to your AOL account." Surprise! That might not be the most effective way to gain trust. So I think the reason why Andrew brought me onto this project is because I'm a words person. That's pretty much the only thing I know how to do as a future lawyer. And we brainstormed the best way to get this information out. So the first way that we wanted to do that was to do industry partnerships. So looking at people who already had some sort of backing behind their name, an organization that people trusted. So we approached Defending Digital Campaigns, DDC, which is a nonprofit that provides cybersecurity to elections and campaigns, and we partnered with them, and they were so kind as to take up our research and help distribute it to their constituents, and through that we gained a little bit of what's the word?
So the lesson for any future entrepreneurs and maybe the students in the room is you might have a great idea. Someone else probably also had something like ideally probably pretty similar. Before you go and try to bring that places, go talk to the people who know how to do that. DDC is this awesome nonprofit that exists like solely for the reason of helping campaigns with cybersecurity. A lot more trustworthy to campaigns than Andrew and Veronica. So look for the people who have those trusted relationships already in the industry you're looking at and find ways to help solve problems that they have. That's sort of the approach that we took with trying to build this.
Yeah, so we wanted to make cybersecurity campaign friendly. So Andrew, in his basement tech lair, came up with the idea of Voter Guard. And it's essentially a we're reluctant capitalists, but we're not.
This is my future billion-dollar election security empire that you're talking about.
But yeah, we came up with just this entity effectively to get this information out, a landing page where people could come for resources, and we created these little scorecards effectively to really understand, to provide to people so that they could understand their risk for what could happen, or just identifying the cybersecurity risks that they could experience. And that was our way of trying to make this a friendlier situation, try to gain trust with people and present it to the general population in a way that was digestible and easily understood, and try to get the point across. So, question?
Question.
Talking about scorecards, is there any state that sticks out as like the most secure or the least secure, or is everyone roughly the same?
Remember that we have both a Senate and a House of Representatives, which means that there's a lot more electoral activity in certain states. There's also states that have much more competitive races than other states. The thing is that it's not like as we have more and more major elections, we're starting to realize that it's not just the races for House and Senate that are at risk. It's also down ballot campaigns, especially at the local level, that are of interest because they rely on websites that are run in their county to tell them when the polls open and close, and they're all kind of at risk. The thing with that question, it's a great question, right? How do you call the baby ugly, particularly to the parents in this case? The scorecards was our answer to that. Rather than going to a specific state and saying, "Hey, Maryland, you guys are so much worse than the rest. You're especially worse than the other side too." That was one way to do it, but I think that leans towards the unhelpful side of FUD. But instead, just trying to contextualize, here's what you've got. We understand why you're doing this. We understand how this kind of basic works, but communicating this through a trusted partner, in this case DDC, who could help also provide some additional context. That was how we tried to solve that problem, because the reality is that every state's risk is a little bit different and a little bit unique. Some were worse offenders than others, just whether in terms of magnitude or in terms of the level of exposure or how old on average their WordPress site was. But on average across the board, we even looked at third parties a little bit. There's no statistical difference in the level of exposure between the two major parties and any third party or any state. It's the most bipartisan problem out there.
Should we show them what happens when?
Yeah.
Okay.
Was anybody here at the talk in 2022, by any chance? That's awesome. That's so cool. Well, okay, then for the 2 or 3 of you, you've seen this example before. I always like to use this to kind of highlight how this risk is getting missed. This was back in September 2021, which is incidentally right after I started doing this research. Anonymous took down the Texas State Republican Party website for a couple days. Whole big thing. They put a bunch of Pokemon on there and some other things. I realized that I had looked at the website before this happened, right before it happened, because right about then is when I started kicked off the whole hookshot monitoring thing. What I found at the time was a couple hundred private accounts, about half of them had been breached at the time. What I would say is probably pretty run-of-the-mill for a state party. A lot of emails, a lot of exposure, but not anything that I thought was outlandishly risky. And then I looked at it after, and it had somehow gotten worse. I'm not saying this is how Anonymous got in and did this, right? There was concerns with their service provider as well, but what this pointed out to me is that this risk was getting missed even after millions of dollars in IR and investigations. Somebody was looking at this and saying yep, this isn't a problem. Let's go back and put the private emails back up on there. Remember why campaigns do this. They have to be reachable and they have to be accessible. But nobody came in here and tried to understand why this organization was doing that. We're so quick to point the finger and say, hey, we need this firewall, we need this appliance, we need this incident response process. It's harder sometimes to come in and take the time to understand what an organization's doing and find a risk-informed solution that still lets them do that, but helps to quantify and eliminate some of the risk they faced. The number of state parties that do this through reform now is starting to go up. That's, I think, trending in a good direction. But a lot of them still look a lot like Texas after they got hacked. So, what would I do differently next time? I spent a lot of time just looking at the problem. It was really interesting to me. I was just fascinated by why they did this. I wanted to understand more about it. I spent so long just looking at that problem before I ever started thinking about, okay, let's build something to fix it. The scorecards took an embarrassing amount of time to think of because I was so fixated on oh, if I just show somebody the numbers, they'll get it. They'll want to fix this. Don't go it alone. It's way more fun to do this when you have other folks on a team who can bring energy and bring the same passion you have for it. And the more people you bring in, the more people that get brought in. Not working on this alone has been one of the best experiences. Learning how to build a team, learning how to find partners to solve problems. I said not to email the DNC CISO directly, but if you do, he might email you back. At least the former one now, Steve, who ended up being a really good resource for us to just say, hey, I think maybe you should think about it this way. But if you do, he might answer your email, and you might get a little more help than you had expected. Most importantly, ask for help. Whether you are trying to start a business, trying to start a research venture thing, starting a new job, ask for help. There are a lot of people out there who want to help you and want to see you succeed. The best way to get them into your corner is to just ask for a little bit of help.
And we have the I want you, Uncle Sam illustration there as just one final request. This is me speaking outside of my voter guard official capacity and as somebody who cares very deeply about law as a law student. You all have special skills in this room, and as we said, these campaigns are under-resourced and understaffed. So if that's something that you feel, if you feel nervous about what we've talked about, if you feel inspired, if you haven't been listening, maybe tune in now. Please go volunteer with organizations that you care about, with politicians that you care about. We don't care how you do it, where you do it, but just use the skills that you all have honed in this room. I don't have them, so as somebody who doesn't have them, I'm just asking all of you to go and make a difference. This is such an easy for you, hard for me thing to address, and that's a way that you can make such a big difference in your community. So,
I think we got some time for some questions, if anybody's still got some. Yes, sir.
I'll quickly summarize. Do you guys see any sort of standardization or baseline certification coming from the data that you presented in this type of space so that people aren't building on top of tech from 2004 when I was in middle school?
It's a great question. Part of the problem is structural because any standard that you put out has a ceiling of about 50% adoption because only one side's going to do it. If you try to standardize and say, hey guys, you should both be doing the exact same thing and using the exact same platform, it's going to be tough. So I think there's a degree of that. I've been really, really encouraged by, I'll give Steve a shout out here on the DNC side for a lot of his work in trying to standardize some of the tech ecosystem for a party, starting at the national level. But it may surprise you to learn that in a lot of cases, the national party and the state party offices don't always get along. They don't always see issues or organization the same way. So it's a really tough challenge, even for the parties themselves, to solve. I think the best way we can get after that, maybe not necessarily a blanket standard across the board, is just more awareness and more education about this. And that's really a big part of what we tried to tackle with providing research to DDC, with providing reports to the community on this. Tim, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, okay, stop right here. So in social science, the big problem that you have when you map any data is that you end up looking at something that is just a population density map. And so looking at this graph here, even though I have to do linear interpolation between both graphs together, you still end up with something that looks vaguely like a population density graph. The one standout that there are two pieces of standout information that look weird to me here. Why is Tennessee such a standout? And why does, Indiana, yeah. Well, okay, I know why Indiana. We know why Indiana.
The one that's, it's tough to see on here, but it's actually this guy right here.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting standout.
Yeah.
It has to do, in some cases, with how well organized the state party is. In some cases, they're honestly like victims of their own success in organizing. Where
what I'm trying to pull at is that you're basically scraping the data from the websites and then correlating and matching it with basically the equivalent of like the Have I Been Pwned database, right? Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's part of it, yeah.
All right. Great. No, go on with what you were saying.
I was just saying, in some cases, the parties end up being victim of their own organizing skills, where in Massachusetts' case, They are an exceptionally well-organized state party, at least from the outside looking in.
Kind
That
of.
has, well, yeah, I know some insiders might have different views on that, but very, very organized with their county parties and their boroughs, where it's just better. Like the tech stacks are more reachable, they're more mature, which means that they have more information listed on the county and city websites that tends to reflect on a darker density because there's more county parties in the state that are better organized and more digitally integrated.
How far back of basically the have I been pwned data did you look at? So if you had data from 2000, let's go ahead and say 4, that's possibly useless, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is just the last. This map is the last 3 years. I've looked at it starting as far back as 2016. I think is when the earliest versions of the websites that I pull and find emails on. But this is just the last 3 years of breaches.
All right. Thanks.
I'm sure this is a obvious answer to this question, but is this an inherently American problem, or do we see these or is it standardized across the world? Like when we talk about other democracies across the world, do we have similar amounts of exposure and breaches? Is it different statistically at all, or are we all just kind of doing the thing wrongly?
I looked a little bit at local and regional Canadian political parties, and the map is pretty similar. We've only done a tiny bit of looking at the EU. Their political tech ecosystem is a little bit less developed than ours. There's not as much spending on elections and much tighter rules about how much they can spend. They don't have quite the robust tech ecosystem that we have in the United States for politics. I looked at Canada, though, and the levels of exposure. There's not quite as much emails listed, but levels of exposure are pretty similar there as well.
Awesome. Thanks.
Having interacted with some local organizations that have done some stuff having interacted with some local organizations and campaigns before at a local level, I know a lot of them, you can give them all this information, but as you said, their main job is to get elected, right? How do you get them to actually take the step? You can show them all the information, but a lot of them might just throw up their hands and be like, well, I can't worry about this.
Well, you can't force people to do what they don't want to do, but I think that that's what we've been brainstorming is how do you convey a problem to people to make them care about it? And I think the approach that we've been taking is by identifying the fact that it's not just their information that becomes part of the problem, it's everybody that they care about. Because it's not just, is your website secure, unsecure? Is your email going to get hacked? It's people might not show up to the polling place because somebody might put up on your website, hey, polls are closed actually at 2 p.m. today, don't show up. And that, ends half of the day voting. So identifying the problem in that way is not like a scared straight tactic, but in a way of just identifying how serious of an issue it is. And I think that's why we have that call to action that I was saying is you all have the skills. So if somebody throws up their hands and they're like, we don't know how to do that, then hopefully people in their community can volunteer. We also through Voter Guard have a little consulting wing of things where people can come to us and ask us questions of how do I set this up? How do I do all the things that we've been talking about? So good question.
There's a couple over here.
Thank you. Great presentation, by the way. Thank you very much. This may be a real hard question to answer or maybe propose to you, but the one thing I haven't seen here, and it might be out of your control, but have you had thoughts about how do we address maybe the social aspect, social media, and what is it that you're doing about that, and what kind of things are you basically trying to inoculate or advise your customers?
Yeah.
It seems like a really wide and fat question, and I apologize, but that seems to be usually the Achilles heel.
It's also one of the first things campaigns ask about is hey, what am I doing on social media? Am I doing enough with accounts? the three things that like the DDC tends to try to hammer home with campaigns that we try to echo, because I think it addresses most of the major risks, again, like state and local, is setting up two-factor, using a secure like form of two-factor authentication, setting up some email security, and then having some basic website security. The fourth one would probably be looking at account-specific security for social media platforms and some of the other civic tech platforms. And this is basics. This is cyber hygiene 101. It's changing passwords. It's not using a phone as your two-factor authentication mechanism. Stuff like that. That DDC has done a really good job of putting these into very digestible, understandable guides for the campaigns. That's usually what we try to message is just, hey, let's focus on the basics. Let's just get you set up and secure so you can run for 6 months and then securely spin you down after.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All the way over there.
Thanks. I'm really curious about this sort of adjacency to information warfare and some of the things we've been seeing like in the last decade, say, with regard to, say, Russian misinformation, now Chinese misinformation. I remember hearing a story a number of years ago about Estonia, how Estonia was reacting to some Russian misinformation. They had, it was almost like the organism was developing its own immune system to these new attacks, right? And it seems like it's not exactly what you're talking about, but it's almost adjacent. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are if this kind of fits into that paradigm or where you see that going and so on.
Yeah, it's a great question. The short version, what I would say is like when I was at Cybercom, when I worked at the other side of the building, what we focused on was threat actors, on the potential for APTs trying to hack election-related infrastructure or political parties, and focusing on the foreign adversary. And I felt like the thing that was really, really tough and difficult to deal with legally and policy-wise for the federal government, but for like even local governments, is working with political parties. The rules that govern the way the government can interact with political parties are, in some cases, like unflinchingly rigid. And a lot of times it's because they're dealing with our money and our votes, so it's rigid for a good reason. But this is the hole that DDC has tried to fill, is how can we bridge the private sector working with political campaigns, because it's tough for the federal government too. The thing that to answer your, like on the IW perspective, the thing that scared me, when I was looking at election security as a Fed, it wasn't the national vote count being hacked. It wasn't, the presidential campaigns being hacked. And then, of course, 2024 happened. But it was these local county offices where you have 50 or 60 votes in a swing county in a competitive state that get even just the allegation of being influenced because a website went down or a website had misinformation planted by a threat actor who has an email address and a web browser. Because that's, in most cases, all it takes to weaponize this information against a local party that does not have anywhere near the resourcing or skills to deal with an APT.
Really enjoyed your talk. When you talk about local political campaigns, and I think about my city and county elections, sometimes those candidates will only have a social media account, like a Facebook page that's public. Beyond websites, did you look at those to see if there was any exposure in their content?
We looked at a little bit of that. It's tough because of platform restrictions. I tried to look at Facebook and LinkedIn and integrate that to web scraper. It's a little tough. I'd say the part of that I looked at specifically was how are campaigns securing those, and looking at, in some cases, the emails associated with the campaign's Facebook page and whether or not I had a password for it. And we're talking stuff like MAGA 2024 or website password Pennsylvania 02 2024, right? Like very, very basic stuff. So I never really figured out the part of Facebook groups or Facebook pages quite so much as it was a little bit easier to look at the websites. It's a great question, and like the social media part will always be an important part of the campaign tech stack. So I think it ought to be looked at. It wasn't really a major part of those numbers though up there. Do we have time for one last one? And we've got a question up here in the front.
Great talk. Not what I thought you were going to talk about. I'm glad I came. But
is there somebody that you'd recommend as a resource for people who are, besides Matt Blaze, who's investigating if the elections themselves were actually honorable, both in 2020 and 2024?
Anybody but me.
No, I know it's not you. I'm asking if you can nicely tell me where to go.
I could nicely tell you where to go.
In other words, just tell me where to go, period. But you know what I meant.
Yeah. It's difficult right now where a lot of my former colleagues and folks that I've worked with on the federal side are unfortunately no longer in those roles due to some decisions being made about election security and election integrity. It's a tough time. I still think that most of CIS's projects and content on spotting misinformation and election integrity are fantastic. Unfortunately, a lot of them are now no longer available. But those guides are out there for spotting misinformation and looking at election integrity. CIS is where I would start. Or really just anybody more qualified than I am. Okay, I'd be happy to take any other questions, talk to anybody about this stuff after. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.
Huh?